Good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad to see all of you here today for W.E.B. Du Bois in Perspective, the Nation, the City, and the Church. I'm Canon John Denaro, the rector here, and we've spent many days doing our best to pull this program together, and it means so much that you've come to be part of it. I'm going to refrain from saying much now, which folks who know me will know is shocking, and turn this over to musicians that are joining us to perform works by Black composers. And so I ask you to help me welcome Emily Kalish and Kyle Walker.
Thank you so much for having us both here. I'm Kyle Walker, this is Emily Kalish, and we're excited to play some music by Samuel Coleridge Taylor this afternoon. Has anybody in this room heard of Samuel Coleridge Taylor?
Oh, wow.
Okay, so there's some of us here that have. Now, in this room, has anybody heard of Ludwig van Beethoven? Okay, so I see a lot more hands. So we want to get those first hands, up to close to the second. So this is part of why we're playing this music. And the first piece that we're playing is his violin and piano sonata, which he wrote when he was relatively young. And later in his life, he grew up in England, but he later in his life traveled to the U.S. And that's what kind of brings that connection to us here. But it's a wonderful early work that shows the somewhat orchestral nature of his writing. He wrote really big orchestral works, and you can hear like a lot of sort of stormy characters and ideas. And we didn't want to necessarily leave you on that note. So we're also playing Deep River, which is a transcription that he did of a spiritual that he learned when he traveled here to the U.S.
Yes. So I just wanted to make the connection a little clearer to Du Bois. Our first work was written before Samuel Coleridge Taylor met Du Bois. They met at the Pan-African Conference in 1900, and Samuel Coleridge Taylor was actually the youngest delegate there. And after that, he read Souls of Black Folk. They became like really close mutual admirers and friends and corresponded. And I think the biggest influence you hear in his music is that he became really interested in particularly the plight of African Americans, and also interested in the African diaspora in general, and including that music in his classical music that he was writing. So the first piece is pre-Du Bois. Second piece is once he had that idea of really wanting to incorporate African American music into his own writing. So enjoy.
What a wonderful way to begin our program. Thank you, Emily and Kyle. Welcome, especially to those of you who have just come for our program, W.E.B. Du Bois in Perspective, the Nation, the City, and the Church. I'm Canon John Dinero, the rector here, and we like to say about our church that we stand at the intersection of faith, culture, and community. And that's what this conversation is about, welcoming people in to a dialogue about issues of the day. I think that we're also kicking off Black History Month with this program. And as I said at church earlier, when times get hard, it's important to be together. And I think now is the moment for us to do our part in helping to bend the arc of history toward justice. I know that W.E.B. Du Bois did that, and there are some wonderful colleagues to each other, I suppose my colleagues too, here to illuminate just how Du Bois did that. And I'm going to tell you about them and introduce them to offer their words. Phillip Luke Sinitiere is a scholar in residence at the Du Bois Center at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and the author and editor of Citizen of the World, the late career and legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois, and Forging Freedom in W.E.B. Du Bois's Twilight Years, No Deed But Memory. Lavelle Porter is the distinguished lecturer at Macaulay Honors College, City University of New York, and he is the author of Blackademic Life, Academic Fiction, Higher Education, and the Black Intellectual. And he is also a licensed New York City walking tour guide. I'm signing up. And the Reverend Dr. Craig Townsend is the Associate for Faith Formation here at St. Anne and the Holy Trinity Church and Pro-Cathedral, and the author of Faith in Their Own Color, Black Episcopalians in Antebellum, New York City. Please welcome first Phil Sinitiere, and then Dr. Porter, and then Dr. Townsend. Thank you, gentlemen.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be with you all today. Before I begin, I'd like to offer some thanks. First, to the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church for a research grant that has allowed me to be with you all today in Brooklyn. I'd like to give a shout out to Reverend Craig and Canon John for their hospitality and accommodations during my stay. And I would finally like to salute my colleagues and comrades at the W.E.B. Du Bois Center at UMass Amherst, where I serve as the scholar in residence for supporting my work for many years. Today I want to talk about W.E.B. Du Bois and Shirley Graham Du Bois's Black History in Brooklyn. I want to talk about some stories and some accounts of their intellectual and activist work while they lived in Brooklyn from 1951 until October of 1961. And as we advance the slide, I want to spend a few moments talking about the context of the times in which they lived. They were both born in the 19th century and lived until the early years of the Cold War. Du Bois was born in 1868 in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. 95 years later, he died in West Africa in Accra, Ghana. Shirley Graham Du Bois was born in 1896 in Indianapolis, Indiana. 80 years later, she died in Peking, now Beijing, China. And as you can see from the events listed on the screen, they lived through extraordinary times. Extraordinary times for American history, extraordinary times for the history of the world. And as Canon John mentioned this morning, they provided light for many generations. And not only did they live through these astonishing world events that impacted the work that they did, their writing, their creativity, their public speaking has shaped how we have come to understand many of these events today. And so as we advance the slide, I want to spend a few minutes talking about the work that both Du Bois and Graham Du Bois carried out while they lived here in Brooklyn Heights from 1951 to October of 1961 at 31 Grace Court. For his professional life, Du Bois was a professor, he was a writer, he was a novelist, he was a poet, he was a public speaker, he was a Pan-Africanist, he was a communist. When he lived here in Brooklyn for those 10 years, he wrote newspaper articles for the Daily Worker, the newspaper of the Communist Party. He wrote essays for Paul Robeson's Freedom newspaper. He also wrote news stories for the National Guardian. Du Bois was heavily involved in the peace movement in the 1950s, and he wrote pamphlets proclaiming and supporting peace. He wrote poetry here in Brooklyn, including a poem titled Ghana Calls, which acknowledged and celebrated the independence of Ghana in 1957. He wrote with Shirley a book called In Battle for Peace, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes. And finally, among the last books that Du Bois wrote was a trilogy called The Black Flame. It was a large-scale historical novel, autobiographical in nature, and the book cover that you see on the screen is of Volume 3, titled Worlds of Color, which my distinguished co-panelist, Dr. Lavelle Porter, will tell us more about shortly. And the next slide is of Shirley Graham Du Bois, who for her professional life was also a teacher and professor. She was a librarian, she was a public speaker, she was a playwright, she wrote opera, she was an accomplished and award-winning author. When she lived in Brooklyn for those 10 years at 31 Grace Court, she also wrote essays for Communist Party publications such as Political Affairs and Masses and Mainstream. Among her many writing accomplishments, she authored historical biographies for young readers, and many of these books won awards. When she lived here in Brooklyn, among the books that she published, two of which you see on the screen, one was a biography of Pocahontas published in 1953, and in 1955 she published a book on a text on Booker T. Washington. Yet there's more to the story of the Du Bois' life in Brooklyn, because the next slide shows another momentous event in their lives when they got married in February of 1951. Now, they had met many, many years previous, but they reconnected in the 1930s. They became friends, they became confidants, They became romantically involved, and in February of 51, they got married and moved to 31 Grace Court. At the time of their wedding, at the time of their marriage, Du Bois and Shirley were heavily involved in the peace movement, as the next slide shows. They had engaged in trying to eradicate the threat of nuclear war, specifically in this immediate context, working with an organization called the Peace Information Center, which was active in 1950. And their work brought them to the attention of the federal government, which had surveilled Du Bois and Shirley for many years by that point. And in February of 1951, Du Bois was arrested under suspicion of being a foreign agent, of working for Moscow. He was arrested under charged under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So he was arrested in February of 1951, bailed out, and spent the ensuing months raising money for legal fees, he and his co-defendants. In November of 1951, astonishingly, surprisingly, Du Bois and his co-defendants were acquitted because he was in fact not a Russian agent. As he told the US government in a letter in response, he was an American citizen and he supported peace, justice, and liberation. Now, when Du Bois got arrested in 1951, many people deserted him. Friends stopped talking to him under suspicion and fear that they would be wrapped up in this anti-communist dragnet during the McCarthy era. But that was not the case with everybody, as we see on the next slide, because people, particularly in New York and elsewhere, and particularly working class folks across the world, supported Du Bois and his work for the peace movement. They marched in the streets, and as the next slide shows, artists drew political cartoons. In this case, Du Bois in Handcuffs by the artist Maurice Becker, published in the National Guardian in 1952, which visually captured the anti-black, anti-communist repression going on at the time, but also visualized the importance of peace work that Du Bois and Shirley and many others were engaged in. Again, Du Bois was arrested in 51, acquitted, February of 51, acquitted in November of 51, and a few months thereafter, as the next slide shows, they co-wrote and published a book with masses and mainstream publishers called In Battle for Peace, the story of my 83rd birthday. So Du Bois was in his 80s, arrested, acquitted, involved in peace activism. And this is an image of the paperback version of the original, one of the original editions of this book. This book talked about their trial, talked about his travels across the world. It talked about his commitment to peace, justice, and liberation. And the photograph on the cover of this text is among my favorite of Dr. Du Bois. And it was taken here at 31 Grace Court in his library. You can see some of his books behind him, the bookshelves. And Du Bois is characteristically dressed in a three-piece suit. He looks at the camera, he looks at the viewer, he looks at us in dignified defiance of the anti-communist context of which he was a part of, and he stands in dignified resolution and commitment to peace and justice in this picture as well. There were other stories that are important to understanding the Du Bois's Brooklyn period. And as the next slide shows, there was Dr. Herbert Apteker, his wife Faye, and their daughter Bettina. Du Bois and Herbert Apteker met in the late 1940s, mid-1940s, when they shared an office at the headquarters of the NAACP. Du Bois worked at the NAACP from 1944 to 48, working on international civil rights. Apteker was a young PhD from Columbia in history, writing about black history, writing about revolts of the enslaved at that particular period. And he was among a few white scholars working in black studies at this particular juncture in history, and he had admired Du Bois for many years, and they became colleagues, then they became friends. And so when they lived in Brooklyn, the Aptekers and the Du Boises would get together for dinner, for celebrations. But in 1946, Du Bois, who was in his latter years, asked Apteker if he would edit his correspondence and later publish his writings. Apteker, of course, said yes and spent the next 40, nearly 50 years publishing Du Bois's writings. And so today there are over 50 Du Bois anthologies edited by Apteker that scholars use to carry out their work. And when the Du Boises decided to leave for Ghana, at the invitation of Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, when they decided to leave the United States and move to Accra in 1961, they had to figure out what they were going to do with Du Bois's massive archival collection of speeches, manuscripts, letters, etc. So they decided, because Apteker was going to edit his work, to leave a third of the collection with the Aptekers in their home. They decided to take a third of the collection with them to Ghana, and they decided to give the final third of the collection to Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, Du Bois's alma mater. But the summer before they left, they hired a then 16-year-old Bettina Apteker, a rising high school junior, to assist with organizing and getting the papers ready to send to Nashville. And as the next slide shows, Bettina offered her recollections of working with Du Bois and meeting with Shirley in the summer of 1961. She said this: "I was a sort of research assistant. He was 93 and I was 16. He worked at his desk and I worked at the filing cabinets. Dr. Du Bois instructed me on the piles to make through which he would later sort, including letters, newspaper clippings, journal articles, and so on. We started very promptly at 9 a.m. He was always formally dressed in a suit, vest, tie, even at home in the August heat. Invariably, we then spent a while talking, relaxed, enjoying the relative cool of the shaded garden and its floral gifts." Again, you can see this at 31 Grace Court, and we're actually going to see some photos later of that place. By 1:15, we were back at work, and we stopped at about 4 p.m. This was 5 days a week and lasted through August until I went back to school. And one of the most important pieces of this observation was Bettina's reference to Shirley Graham, who, as she says today in her memory, was present and loving. Now, as we turn our attention to some of Shirley Graham Du Bois's publications on Du Bois, as the next slide shows, one of the important things to remember and to note on this occasion is that it was the work of Shirley Graham Du Bois that kept Du Bois's name alive, that kept his legacy moving after his death in 1963. And she did this in a number of ways. She was not only devoted to Dr. Du Bois, the person, she was devoted to Dr. Du Bois, the intellectual, as Du Bois was devoted to her and learning from her and her work. So in the 1970s, she started to promote this legacy in new ways, she published 2 books, a memoir in 1971 titled His Day is Marching On, about her life with Du Bois. And at the end of her life, in the mid-1970s, she was editing a visual history, what she called a pictorial biography of her time with Du Bois. And the majority of that book chronicles visually their life together traveling the world, and a number of chapters have photographs of their time in Accra. And it is because of Shirley's conscientiousness and commitment not just to peace and freedom that we have numerous photographs of the couple in their late years. But there's one more piece of Du Bois's legacy that I want to mention with respect to Shirley's work. And as we encounter the next slide, we see some boxes of archival materials in what looks like a library, which is correct. And as I mentioned earlier, Shirley was instrumental in making sure that a portion of Du Bois's papers and manuscripts made it to Fisk in September of 1961. And you will recall that I mentioned a third of the collection traveled to Ghana with the Du Boises in 1961. Well, in 1973, she made sure that this portion of the collection of Du Bois's manuscripts made it to UMass Amherst, where the papers reside today, both in physical form, as you can see by the picture, but also in digital form, where any one of us can access many of these writings literally as we speak. And so, as I make it to the final slide, I want to offer and leave you with the words of Shirley Graham Du Bois. And in the photo on this last slide, the Du Boises are characteristically looking to their left. And I want to read a few lines from His Day is Marching On, Shirley's memoir of her time with Du Bois. And I want us to reflect and remember what she said, because she's talking about their time here at Holy Trinity. She's talking about meeting the Melishes in some detail, which my other distinguished co-panelist, Dr. Craig Townsend, will talk about shortly. She's talking about meeting the Melishes, and she's talking about time here in this space. When we moved to Brooklyn, Shirley wrote, a membership committee gave a reception for us in the parlors of the church. When Negro History Week was approaching in February, the Reverend Mr. Melish asked Du Bois if he would give a lecture on Africa. And somebody took a photograph of that occasion. And the flyer for this event, you will recall, has a photograph of Du Bois with a map of Africa behind him. That was at that event that Shirley is talking about. And I'll conclude with this. Shirley wrote that under Howard Melish's pastorage, the parish had expanded and the church prospered. As new people came into the old and conservative community on the Heights, everybody was welcomed at Holy Trinity. And this welcome included Negroes, Puerto Ricans, the foreign-born, and poor. Holy Trinity, she concluded, thus became a community church in the truest sense of the word. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Phil, and thank you, Craig, for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful event. Thank you all for coming out and joining us today. Okay. So for the past 2 years at Macaulay Honors College, I've been teaching a class on justice and equity. It has been an experience, to say the least, to be teaching this class in this moment where the very subject matter of the course has been ruled illegal. This isn't hyperbole. We are co-teaching this course with 3 other honors colleges around the country, 2 of which are in states where laws against critical race theory and DEI have been passed. And we've had to strategize ways to run the course so that they won't be flagged by local officials in those states who are surveilling universities for woke content. In these times, Du Bois is one of the voices that I've turned to help understand the struggle. From one of my co-teachers of this course, Professor Ron Adoko at the University of Pittsburgh, I am borrowing one of our course's engagement principles, which is that we realize we are all teachers and learners. In that spirit, I have to acknowledge how much I've learned from the work of my co-panelists, just as we were preparing for this conversation. Phil Sinitiere is quite simply one of the most knowledgeable and prolific Du Bois scholars on the planet right now. His book, Citizen of the World, is required reading on the late years of W.E.B. Du Bois. Likewise, I've learned a great deal from getting to know Craig and reading his book on Black Episcopalians in New York, which contextualizes the importance of St. Philip's Episcopal Church as a Black New York institution. So since we are talking about Du Bois in church, I thought I would start with a text and a genre that might seem surprising from Du Bois, a prayer. It's on the next slide. We pray tonight, O God, for confidence in ourselves, our powers, and our purposes in this beginning of the new year. Ward us from all lack of faith and hesitancy, and inspire in us not only the determination to do a year's work well, but the unfaltering belief that what we wish to do, we will do. Such faith, O Lord, is born of works. Every deed accomplished finishes not only itself, but is fallow ground for future deeds. Abundantly endow us, O Father, with this deed-born faith. Amen. So this is from the collection Prayers for Dark People, one of my favorite deep cuts from Du Bois. It's a collection of occasional prayers and meditations that were written and assembled by Du Bois around 1909 and 1910, which he intended as a series of spiritual lessons for his Atlanta University students, which is where he was teaching at the time. These prayers were later compiled, edited, and published by none other than Herbert Aptheker in 1980. Du Bois himself rejected any personal profession of faith, but you can see in The Souls of Black Folk and in other works of his profound engagement with Christianity. Many of these meditations and prayers for dark people, like this one, emphasize the importance of work, labor, education, and social justice. I particularly found them inspiring as we embark on this new year that will undoubtedly bring many more difficulties. But I return to Du Bois for these reminders that the work is the work, and doing the work is as important as ever. So when I teach about Du Bois, I always have my students take a step back and look at the historical context of his life, just as Phil did for us in the opening presentation. He died at the age of 95 years old, having lived from 1868 to 1963. And I have them stop and think about that expanse of time, okay? We're talking about someone who was born just 3 years after the end of the Civil War, who lived to see the birth and development of the modern civil rights movement in the 20th century, and who in fact had a hand in that movement's existence since he was one of the founding members of the NAACP, which he helped to start in 1909. So the next slide. We are mostly talking about old Du Bois today, but I thought I would share some pictures of young Du Bois for perspective. Here he is with his classmates at Fisk University in 1888. He's the second from the left. And the next slide, here he is with his graduating class in Harvard in 1890. So that's him on the right this time. Du Bois died in the city of Accra in Ghana on August 27th, 1963, the day before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. With a life that vast and a body of work that includes volumes of history, sociology, autobiography, and fiction, we can only scratch the surface today in this conversation. So the focus of this panel is on Du Bois in New York City. And on my walking tours of Harlem, I've often talked about St. Philip's Episcopal Church as a microcosm for the history of Black New York, and specifically the history of Black Harlem. To trace the different locations of St. Philip's through the years, from its first location on Center Street in the old Five Points, just after the congregation was organized in 1809, to its move into the area of West Midtown, then known as the Tenderloin, in the 1880s, and then its move into Harlem by 1911, into its current building, which was designed by the noted Black architect Verner Woodson Tandy. St. Philip's has followed the pattern of Black settlement in Manhattan and remains an important institution in Harlem to this day. In 1951, Shirley Graham and W.E.B. Du Bois were married. At the time, she was 54 and he was 83, and that age gap is simply a fact of their story. After Shirley sold her house in the St. Albans neighborhood of Queens, they temporarily lived together in Harlem at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, where Du Bois lived from 1944 to 1951. And this is a rather famous residence in the Sugar Hill section of Harlem, whose residents included the future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, painter Aaron Douglas, and sculptor Elizabeth Catlett, among others. The Du Boises then moved to 31 Grace Court in Brooklyn Heights under a cloud of federal investigation. And Phil just kind of filled you in on what that was all about. In the past, I've said on my tours that Shirley and W.E.B. purchased their Brooklyn Heights home from the playwright Arthur Miller, who had faced his own problems with McCarthyism and was sympathetic to their plight. Now, tour guides have a tendency to lie sometimes, right? Or in a more generous way, I would say sometimes we have to revise our narratives, all right? In actuality, it's not entirely clear that Arthur Miller immediately knew who he was selling the house to, right? And that an agent or a broker of his was actually involved in the sale. But Miller and Du Bois were aware of each other eventually, and it is true that Miller sympathized with the Du Boises and was pleased that they were living in the house. So the next slide features Du Bois at 31 Grace Court, standing in front of a painting of Frederick Douglass, and maybe Phil will give us a little backstory about that later. I want to try to keep on time. And the next slide, this is their backyard at Grace Court, so this is where Bettina Aptheker was talking about spending time with them. So the Du Boises lived at 31 Grace Court until 1961, when they departed the United States for Ghana, where W.E.B. died in 1963. During their stay in Brooklyn Heights, Du Bois completed 4 books. And stop, think about that for a second. This is a man in his 80s and 90s, completed 4 books, and these are just the actual, full books, not to mention all the different articles and other things that he was doing. So that included In Battle for Peace, the story of my 83rd birthday, and it includes the 3 novels of the Black Flame, which were first published when he was 89, 91, and 93 years old. So most people who have heard of Du Bois know him as a sociologist, historian, essayist, and activist. Fewer know that he was also an avid fiction writer. Some of his fictional works include the short story of The Coming of John, which is included in the landmark essay collection, The Souls of Black Folk. So if you've read that book, then you've read a little Du Bois fiction already. Next slide. His first novel, The Quest of the Silver Fleece, was published in 1911. Then next, Dark Princess in 1928. And then the books that comprise the Black Flame trilogy, in the next slide, include The Ordeal of Mansart in 1957, Mansart Builds a School in 1959, and Worlds of Color in 1961, all published while Du Bois was living here in Brooklyn Heights. Now, the literary critic Edmund Wilson once wrote about Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans, which is a perplexing novel of nearly 1,000 pages, that, quote, "I confess that I have not read this book all through, and I do not know whether it is possible to do so," end quote. Now, I've had similar feelings about the Black Flame. I have indeed read them all through, but I also acknowledge that the full trilogy is a bit of an endurance test. The challenge of reading Stein's The Making of Americans comes from her signature use of repetition, through which she explores the philosophy of language and the mechanics of narrative. For Du Bois, it is the historical and sociological ambition of these novels, with their saturation of historical details, political commentary, and an unwieldy ensemble cast of characters that makes this trilogy a challenging read. However, in The Black Flame, Du Bois strives to make sense of his life's work and the Black experience through a narrative centered on a Black educator named Emanuel Mansart, who was born in 1876 and lives into the 1950s. W.E.B. took some elements from Shirley Graham's life and lent them to his female characters in The Black Flame, most notably in the form of Jean Dubignon, a light-skinned, educated Black woman sociologist who becomes dean of the Black College in Georgia, where Emanuel Mansart is president. W.E.B. gives some of Shirley's creative side to Mansart's daughter from another marriage, Sojourner, who was a talented violinist and composer. Du Bois uses the travels of Emanuel Mansart and Jean Dubignon as a device to explore a broader world of color beyond the reaches of white supremacy. In Chapter 6, Color in the West Indies, Mansart sends Jean Dubignon on a trip inspired by a Caribbean intellectual he met in Europe. And he writes, quote, "A Negro named James gave me his book to read, and it is revolutionary. We must include the West Indies in our survey." The references, of course, to the Trinidadian intellectual C.L.R. James and his book, The Black Jacobins, one of numerous cameo appearances made by historical figures in these novels. So born into the violent racism of post-Reconstruction South Carolina, Manuel Mansart begins to look outward to a greater world. Most of his life's work had been bound up in the struggle for African-American education and civil rights, but he comes to recognize that his own particular situation is part of a larger reality. And this is a long quote from the text. Somehow it seemed to him that his students as individuals and the seething dark millions back of them were melting away from his touch, were getting further and further from his influence. Once they were all his people. He had had his arms about them and was protecting and guiding them. This was no longer true. Other things, the world itself, had intruded and come between him and the Negro people. He had been sucked up into greater and wider causes, peace, socialism, the meaning of all life. He wanted now to rid himself of diversion and get back to the Negro problem, to concentrate all his energy and hope there. And yet, if he and his folk were part of this wider world, how could he or they ever really separate? End quote. So here Du Bois is dramatizing the dilemmas that he faced later in his life, particularly as he and Shirley did become involved in communism and spent time in China, where Shirley would go on to live after W.E.B's death and eventually died in 1977 at 80 years old. In a chapter near the end of Worlds of Color, titled The Dismissal of Jean Dubignon, the storyline follows a conspiracy against her at the college where they were teaching, a development that clearly reflects on Du Bois' own last years with Shirley as they ran afoul of McCarthyism and America's anti-communist hysteria. Worlds of Color would turn out to be the last book that Du Bois himself would publish in his long career. It fittingly explores the idea that Black Americans, who white supremacists saw as nothing more than property, and who even after emancipation continued to be marginalized as non-citizens by the American legal system, would turn to the greater world as a way of discovering and recovering their humanity. The Black Flame is a remarkable document that reflects Du Bois' international vision late in his life and expresses his skepticism about the future of democracy in the United States. For these and many other reasons, I think this trilogy deserves a larger place in the scholarship on his life and legacy, and I appreciate the work that Phil and other Du Bois scholars have done to emphasize those latter years in Du Bois' life and all the ways that he and Shirley Graham contributed to the global struggle for freedom. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I too want to just say thanks. I want to say thanks to these guys because this is not my field, okay? And so suddenly I've found myself thrust into the midst of the W.E.B. Du Bois scholarly community, and they've been incredibly welcoming and generous to me, and I'm just delighted to have these two gentlemen here today to talk about, to set the stage for me to talk about what we're doing here, but to provide the context and the importance of why we're digging into W.E.B. Du Bois and Holy Trinity Church. So for those of you who don't know, first of all, this church is Holy Trinity Church, which was shut down during the McCarthy era. And so this context of McCarthyism that you've been hearing about is extremely important to the history of this place. St. Anne's Church is actually 3 blocks down Clinton Street. It's the sort of pink and white striped church you'll see walking by. And in the 1960s, the late 60s, they sold that building to Packer Collegiate Institute, the private school right next door to it, and moved the congregation in here, reopened this church, and added its name to their name as a gesture to this building, St. Anne, and now St. Anne and the Holy Trinity, but as a gesture to the building of Holy Trinity. So I want to talk about how I got started in this. If we could have the next slide, please. This is the Reverend William Howard Melish in his later years. And I want to start with a personal story, which many of you have heard me talk about, but I was originally here 40 years ago as the full-time associate priest. I'm now the very part-time associate priest in my retirement. But 40 years ago, I came in 1984. I was hired by Bill Purcell, who was the rector then. Bill Purcell, when he became rector here, invited William Howard Melish to come back and serve with him on the altar here in Holy Trinity. William Howard Melish is the last priest of Holy Trinity Church and was the priest whose fight for peace, justice, liberation caused the church to be closed down. And I'm going to come back to that. But when I came, I didn't know anything about that. I just knew that there was this old guy who was helping out on Sunday mornings and occasionally preaching. And if you know the Episcopal Church at all, you know that we wear a white robe when we're celebrating Holy Communion with a colored stole, a scarf. And the color is the color of the season. So it's purple for Advent and Lent, it's white for Christmas and Easter. Right now it's Epiphany, we're wearing green. William Howard never wore a seasonal colored stole. He wore a kente cloth stole every Sunday, no matter what it was. And we're desperately hoping we might find this stole, because that would really be cool. Because I asked him one day, one of the first days, I'm like, all right, William Howard, what's with the stole? And he told me that it was given to him by Kwame Nkrumah when Kwame Nkrumah flew him to Ghana to preach Du Bois's funeral sermon. It's taken me 40 years to get back to this, but I have always wanted to know, what is the story there? How did this white Episcopal priest become the guy that W.E.B. Du Bois named in his sealed will to be the person to lead and preach at his funeral sermon? So that's how I got myself into this. All right. So very quickly, let's go to the next slide. This is the cover of the pamphlet that William Howard eventually published of his funeral sermon. And I always refer to him as William Howard. That's what I called him when I knew him. I noticed that the Du Boises seem to call him Howard. Mary Jane, his wife, often called him William. It's really unclear what was going on with his name, but I'm going to keep calling him William Howard because that's how I knew him. And this is the conclusion to his funeral sermon in Accra, Ghana in 1963. Can you give us, well, let's see if we can make the audio clip work. Here we go. Because you got to hear this voice. No, you got to back up. There we go.
So to his farewell to us, we must now say our farewell to him. You, dear W.E.B., have been for all of us one of the great companions, journeyer in your sublime old age, calm, expanded, broad with the haughty breadth of the universe, and yet at the same time, O enjoyer of life and lover of little children, the sharer of our simplicities, you have enabled us to believe once more that man, in the ideal, is so noble and sparkling, such a grand and glorious creature, that over any ignominious blemish in him and in you, we shall ever run to throw our costliest garments.
I'm going to give the rest of my talk in that voice, if I can. Isn't that amazing? He was such a lovely man. He was a really lovely man. But you sure get a feel of the style, right? The voice is really spectacular. Okay, let's go to the next slide and just do a little bit of the context of what went on here. Okay, so this is a great father-son shot, and as Phil pointed out, W.E.B. would be thrilled by the three-piece suit that William Howard is wearing. So this is John Howard Melish, was the rector of this church, as you can see, for 45 years, of Holy Trinity Church. And he hired his son, William Howard, to be his assistant, with the understanding that when John Howard retired, William Howard would take over as rector. And just if you didn't come in this way, if you go out that way, you'll see a bust of John Howard Melish in the entryway out there. And it's a very strange looking one because it has no neck. It's just his head. It's always kind of giving me the willies. But John Howard Melish made this place famous. He was an enormous advocate of social justice and in all sorts of ways. William Howard kind of just took that even further. In the aftermath of the Second World War, he became the president of the National Council for Soviet-American Friendship. You can imagine how that went over in the McCarthy era. He was harassed, he was persecuted, and the vestry here at Holy Trinity eventually demanded that the father, John Howard Melish, fire his son over his extracurricular activities. John Howard refused to do so, and they then went to the bishop and forced John Howard Melish to retire. Weird move, because it then meant that William Howard became the priest in charge of the parish. I don't really understand the logic behind that, but nonetheless, there it was. So now William Howard is in charge, but the bishop and the vestry really want to get him out. The congregation is largely with him, and eventually there are dueling vestries, and then the bishop comes in, and it turns into a 10-year legal battle that results in this building being closed, and it sat empty for 10 years. And William Howard was out of a job here and became a staff representative for the Southern Conference Education Fund, an organization dedicated to ending segregation in the South. And he worked at that for a number of years also. So that's just to give you some of the context and some of the linkage in the McCarthy era of the causes of these two people. Next slide, please. I don't know if you knew, oh yeah, first we have to see this. This is great. This is the second half of a telegram that William Howard sent in 1946 to President Truman about the annual gathering of the National Council for Soviet-American Friendship in Madison Square Garden, requesting a statement of support from President Truman, as he had done in the past, and as had President Roosevelt. Because the National Council for Soviet-American Friendship was started in the aftermath of the Second World War as a government-supported organization, which then, of course, becomes named as a subversive organization. But that's not how it began, and I think that's a really important piece of the story. Okay, next. I don't know if you've heard that W.E.B. Du Bois and Shirley Graham Du Bois lived at 31 Grace Court. Has anyone mentioned that yet? And there's some photographs of them in the yard there, so this is pretty fun. W.E.B. Du Bois and William Howard Melish had contact over the years that seems, at least what we've been able to find, that seems fairly formal, basically requesting each other's support for various causes and projects that they were involved in, both the National Council on Melish's part and some humanitarian activities that Du Bois was doing. But their relationship really seems to develop once the Du Boises move to, where is it? 31 Grace Court, yes. Okay. At which point, John Howard Melish, the father, sends to W.E.B. Du Bois a letter of welcome to Brooklyn Heights, right? As was pointed out, Arthur Miller sold that house, but according to Arthur Miller's autobiography, he didn't know who he was selling it to because the Du Boises weren't sure anyone would sell to a black couple. When it was sold to them, and it was okayed by Arthur Miller, he had to at least okay the sale, the Du Boises became the first black American stone property in Brooklyn Heights since the 19th century. So John Howard sending a letter of welcome is a pretty powerful statement. more powerful statement, however, is that William Howard Melish and his wife, Mary Jane Melish, decided to host a reception, quote, to ease their community acceptance, end quote. This is William Howard's narrative about this, to which, quote, 70 or 80 prominent Heights people were willing to come. So this event was to try to bring them into the community. And clearly, the Du Boises were enormously grateful for that. And there are other narratives in which William Howard talks about attending Christmas parties, etc., loving to be invited to parties at the Du Boises whenever the UN was in session because famous people would always be there, etc., etc. So this is how a friendship started to develop. We also know that in 1956, William Howard and W.E.B. were scheduled to speak at an event at Christ Church Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. And that was the day that it was announced that William Howard had won the International Peace Prize from the World Peace Council, which was a totally Soviet Union-funded entity in Vienna, Austria. But hey, cool prize, right? Anyway, they get there, they arrive at the church, the press has come because they've heard about this, and they start asking a lot of leading questions. There's a lot of back and forth, there's a whole controversy. The rector of the church there kind of freaks out. Du Bois gives his talk too, everybody's going wild. William Howard, writing about this, is basically acknowledging he was pretty scared by the whole thing. But on the train ride back, he said that W.E.B. Du Bois was, quote, cheerful and comforting. He was used to this in a way that William Howard was not yet. If we could have the next slide, please. As has been referenced, right, Negro History Week, okay, was part of the historian Carter Woodson's initial vision in the 1930s, but Du Bois was actually part of that conversation, at least according to one source that I've found. And Du Bois really pushed it again in the 50s. And so he and William Howard, you know, they're colleagues, they're getting to know each other, and sure, we'll do a Negro History Week here, right? And so we've been able to document now 7 years in a row that there's an annual Negro History Week event here at Holy Trinity Church, at least two of which Du Bois spoke. This one is 1955. He did speak on Pan-Africanism. He also came back in 58 because it was his 90th birthday, and they dedicated the entire event to his 90th birthday, and there were speakers to whom he then responded. And so that's, you know, that's kind of a thing about what I'm trying to look into here is how this church, William Howard, but also this church, became more and more involved in the issues of racial justice of the time. And one of the things that we found is that at least in a couple of documents, it's asserted that it's not just the National Council for Soviet-American Friendship that gets William Howard in trouble, it's that there are 2 black men elected to the vestry, the lay board of this church, and that's put some people's noses out of joint as well. Now, some of that perspective comes from the Amsterdam News, the historic black newspaper of New York City. So we haven't been able to document much beyond that, but it's just a really interesting angle because clearly people are upset about it. But you're lifting up Negro History Week over and over again, and so that's why I say, you know, Black History Month came to this church in the 50s in the form of Negro History Week, its predecessor. Also, I did want to make the link to Shirley Graham Du Bois wrote a biography of Phyllis Wheatley, right, the first African-American poet to be published in this country, and she then adapted that into a radio play, and then she apparently adapted that again for a performance here for one of those Negro History Weeks, which I thought was a pretty cool thing too. Next slide, please. What does all this really have to do with us? Well, that's the thing. So I know this story, right? I have this story. So the first thing I do is, you know, go to what we all still know as the Brooklyn Historical Society, but now is the Center for Brooklyn History of the Brooklyn Public Library. I don't know why they needed to change the name, but anyway, a bunch of Melish papers are there. So a group of us, parishioners and I, went over there and spent some time in January of 23 digging into the Melish papers that they have and looking to see what we could find. The coolest thing we found is a 20-page narrative by William Howard of his trip to Ghana to preach the funeral sermon. And because of this and some other photos, which Alan Balicki took and ended up on our website, and I'm going to come back to Alan in just a minute, but on our website, and some Du Bois scholar is cruising the internet, apparently trying to find out who Melish is, puts in Melish's name, and this pops up, and the next thing you know, I'm getting an email from Phil Sinitiere asking me what are we doing and who's this Melish guy. And that's how all of this got launched, how all of this came together. So we dug through all those boxes, but while we're doing this, part of the reason we're doing this is that Alan Balicki and Kay Marshall live at 176 Dean Street, which is the last house that Mary Jane and William Howard Melish lived in. And I'm going to let you talk to them afterwards and try to get the story of how this all came about, because it's pretty complicated and wild. But suffice to say that there's a bunch of boxes that made it to the Historical Society, but there's a lot of boxes that haven't. And there were 40-some boxes in the basement of 176 Dean Street that were the Melish's papers. And Alan and Kay were like, can you get these out of here and maybe we could do something with them? So they've all been moved over here now, and with these volunteers, we're digging through them, and we are going to just keep seeing what we can learn. But the letter from John Howard Melish welcoming W.E.B. Du Bois to the neighborhood, that's in the boxes that we're going through, right? The September 9th, 1963 letter, Dear Dad, William Howard writes, I'm going to Ghana to preach Du Bois's funeral sermon. That's in these boxes. It gives me the chills, right? So that's what's going on here. That's what made this whole event happen. And if we just go to the last slide, I want to close with what Du Bois had to say about William Howard Melish. Again, calling him Howard, right? Howard Melish is one of the few Christian clergymen for whom I have the highest respect, honest and conscientious, believing sincerely in much of the Christian dogma. I like the much part there. In much of the Christian dogma, which I reject, and yet we've already heard he rejects Christian dogma, not faith. And I think that's a really important distinction. But working honestly and without hypocrisy for the guidance of the young, for the uplift of the poor and ignorant, and for the betterment of his city and his country. These two figures, one white, one black, came by their own paths to a kind of joint understanding that world peace, their top goal, wasn't going to happen without racial justice. And we're going to continue to dig into these papers and these sources to try to document how that progress occurred and celebrate this friendship and its historic importance. Thank you very much.
Friends, whenever I organize something, it goes long. But we mustn't, you're welcome to leave if you must, because we promised this would be over by 3. However, it's cold in here, and we brought some folks to fire us up, make sure we get nice and warm. They are the East Coast Inspirational Singers, and I think you're going to want to stick around. Please welcome these good folks. They, on Instagram, posted yesterday, Dear America, we don't need your permission to celebrate Black History Month. So, without further ado, and as they set up, just as far as you need that, I want to thank our speakers, Dr. Sinitiere, Dr. Porter, Dr. Townsend. Can you please give them another round of applause? Because we're going a little late, because we're going a little late, we're foregoing the conversation they might have had with each other and you might have had with them, but I bet they'll stick around for a few minutes with you in the parish hall afterward. So thank you very much. There's a note about an intersection series that we're going to host here on March 2nd about the intersection of sustenance and justice. I hope you'll come. Read all about it at the back of your program and check our website. You're always welcome here. God bless you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are the East Coast Inspirational Singers. We're going to inspire you for a few minutes, and this has been great.
Oh, happy day. Come on, clap your hands. Oh, happy day when Jesus washed, when Jesus washed. Oh, when Jesus washed, He washed my sins away. Oh, happy day. Oh, happy day. Oh, happy day when Jesus washed, when Jesus washed, when Jesus washed, He washed my sins away. Oh, happy day, He taught me. Come on, you know it. To run. And He taught me how to live. And live rejoicing.
announce that we have, if anyone still has a DVD player, we do have some DVDs.
Thank you. We also have some mugs to sell. But anyway, if anyone wants to stick around, please join us in the parish hall. And otherwise, you're always welcome here. Please come back. And thank you again to our speakers.